everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Timeout with Tackle What's Next. I'm your host, Danielle Berman. I am the founder and CEO of Tackle What's Next, where we work to change the narrative around life after sports. And here on Timeout with Tackle What's Next, we chat with athletes, executives, and really just folks that are doing great things about how sport has made a difference and changed the course of their lives and the lessons that they've learned in life outside of the game. So thank you guys for jumping back in. New year, new timeouts. We're really excited about this. And our guest tonight is Jonathan Gustave. He is a mental health therapist, specifically a sports mental health therapist, and he advocates for athletes who seek to overcome the emotional and mental hurdles established during their upbringing so they can show up in life and in their performances better. I think that's really key. He's also the host of the Giant Fundamentals podcast, which works to bridge the gap between athletes and mental health. Jonathan has a Bachelor's of Science in Religious Education from Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama. He also received his Master's in Marriage and Family Therapy at Nova Southeastern University down in South Florida. And he's worked with organizations such as the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the Trayvon Martin Foundation, Broward and Dade County Public Schools, and more. And I just want to say, in light of recent events this weekend with Damar Hamlin, it's so important to be focusing on mental health for athletes. It's really a tough job. And I think it's just a really timely conversation, even more timely. And I just want to reiterate that we're all keeping Damar in our thoughts and prayers, as well as the athletes that were on the field with him. So let's get Jonathan on. Let's have this conversation. I'm really excited. And here we go. Here he is.
Yeah.
Hey, Jonathan, how's it going?
All is well. All is well. Can't complain. How about
Thank
yourself?
you for navigating some tech difficulties to be here with us today. I apologize. We are here. We are ready to rock and roll.
Let's do it. Let's make it happen. Happy New Year, by the way.
Yes, Happy New Year. I was just saying before you jumped in that, really your focus on athlete mental health is just so much in the spotlight this week, obviously due to recent events with Damar Hamlin. And so I think it's a really timely conversation to really be talking to you because, like I mentioned in the intro, you really focus on the kind of relationship between athletes and mental health and how to bridge that gap. So I guess I just want to start by having you talk about how you got into this, going back to the beginning. Do you remember playing sports as a kid and what those sports meant to you, what sports you played, and what that experience was like? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've always been a sports junkie since I was a kid. Specifically basketball and football, baseball, I would dabble into it, soccer. I've always had a very great interest in sports. But what I realized as I got older, the interest came from really just, it was like sports was my big brother per se. It was my big sister. Why? Because I didn't grow up with my siblings. I didn't grow up with my parents. My grandmother raised me. So essentially I was like an only child. And that was a way for me to really connect with other kids in the community as well. This day and age, a lot of kids don't really play outside, but when we were growing up, we played outside. That's all we ever did, right? So that was a way for me to gain some camaraderie with the kids in the neighborhood. I built a lot of friendships that I'm even close with these guys to this day because playing sports. And it was just something that I just always loved and I always gravitated to the point where sports was actually the thing that got me to start reading. Because when I was a kid, I remember in the 4th grade, I will never forget, I had to write my first book report. And the teacher takes us to the library and she says, choose a book and write a book report on it. And I'm like, oh man, like what is, I'm like, reading, I never read like that before unless I had to be called out in class to read. So as I'm going through the books, I'm learning the different sections. I see there's a sports section. I'm like, oh wow. And my first book report ever was on Michael Jordan.
Okay.
And that's
all
when I started reading and stealing my neighbor's, I'm sure she's not listening to this, but I used to steal my neighbor's newspaper to take the sports section out just to walk to school and read it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that's what got me really into loving sports because it was something that really, it it kept me out of trouble as well. I think that's one of the big things. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what was the first sport you played as a kid? Do you remember?
Mm, I believe the first sport I ever played, oh man, I believe it was football.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to be like 6 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's always funny that a lot of people say soccer. A lot of people say football, soccer, basketball. Those are like the
Mhm.
three we hear the
Yeah.
most.
Yeah.
Whatever can get your kids to run around to be like doing stuff active, right? That's I feel like what
Exactly.
parents are going for. Like, this will make you run around. Great, go do it for
Yes,
an hour.
exactly.
But yeah,
I,
no, I think that's awesome. But a couple takeaways I have from your sharing is really that sports really served multiple purposes for you. And I think we see a lot of athletes that don't understand the purposes that sports play in their life. And so for you, you really saw sport and maybe looking back now, but still in the moment as a sibling, kind of a sibling, really being able to build community for you and bring people to your life and kind of impact in that way. I'd love to hear too, in terms of how did you figure out where you wanted to go? So you're playing sports, but you're also using sport as this tool to read and to grow and to learn. How do you figure out where sports takes you? You go to Oakwood University, you kind of figure out you want to pursue a religious degree, you go into mental health. Like, tell me a little bit about that journey. So you're growing up, how are you figuring out what's next? Does sport play a role? Are you thinking about playing sport at a higher level? Tell me a little bit about that conversation.
well, here's the thing. Like, I've always wanted to play like organized sports, but there were two things that went up against me. One was that I grew up in a very strict religious home. So my grandmother was like, "Oh, well, no, you can't play sports because it's kind of like we're like the Jews. You kind of like you don't do things on Friday and Saturdays, right?"
Yeah.
So that was one reason why I never played officially, right? But then the next thing was because eventually I was going to end up playing. But the next thing was I dropped out of high school, right? And here is the connection between the sports and the mental health where it comes into the picture. Now, the reason why I dropped out of high school was because I had major PTSD from when I was in the 8th and ninth grade. Because the communities that I grew up in, it was very difficult. I call it, my friend and I would call it the concrete jungle, right? Very difficult. Like, you're navigating, trying not to get into fights, trying not to this and that. And, as a kid, you're trying to put on a tough face, a tough exterior, like that, everything's okay. But then my ninth grade year, right before I was about to go into high school, because my ninth grade was in middle school still, that year I got into this big fight, gang fight, got jumped by some boys, and that really closed me up as a person. And at that time I didn't realize it. So now when I get to high school, I'm there, but I'm not there. I'm gone. Like, football coaches try to recruit me so much, right? Because I was like, at that time, now I'm 6'8", but at that time I probably was like 6'3", 6'4". So they're trying to really recruit me to play, but I have no desire to play. I have no intention of playing. I didn't even want to be in school. But the straw that broke the camel's back is when the next year I saw that boy and a couple of his friends that I got into the altercation with, I saw them now going to the school. So that really shut me down.
Yeah.
And, I developed a social anxiety, and I said, you know what? I'm not even going to go to school. And at that time, of course, I didn't know. It's literally a decade plus later. That's when I figure out, oh man, okay, this is why I shut down like that, So that's why I'm like, that's where the mental health, I feel like, comes into the picture.
Yeah,
With
that's
the
what I was going to
sport,
ask,
right?
how do you feel like that experience, and thank you for sharing that, because I think there's just so much that we can all learn from sharing some of the things that we've experienced, and especially the anxieties and the, social traumas we've experienced. But you mentioned, like, you realize that now, 10 plus years later, that you were suffering from social anxiety from these experiences, and you weren't there. Like, you were there, but you weren't there.
Right.
What inspired you to go into the mental health world, right? What inspired you? Was it a reckoning on your end that you were like, hey, I need to go to therapy, or I need to start worrying about my mental health? Was it interest in the field? Like, tell me a little bit about how you went from you know, trying to navigate the concrete jungle of high school to mental health therapist and
Yeah.
professional?
So I went on to college, where I got my degree. I was able to get my diploma. I went on to college, did religious education, but when I did it, I just didn't feel right. It didn't feel, it didn't feel like that was me, right? So I just asked a few people around me, like literally 3 people around me. I asked them, I said, okay, what do you see me as? Two of them were good friends of mine, and another one was my wife at the time. And which is still my wife. I said at the time, she's still my wife. Let me correct that, right? So they all said the same thing. They said, man, you give great advice. You listen very well. You're a great counselor. So I was like, all of them said that unanimously. So I was like, that's interesting. Okay. So I had a couple of friends that were getting their master's degree in marriage and family therapy. So I asked them about the program. I asked them about different things, so on and so forth. They said, yeah, you should do it. And it's really good. He definitely see you doing that. So I said, okay, cool. So I went into the degree. I got a master's in marriage and family therapy. And when I tell you that my emotional intelligence just took 10 million leaps, because my world opened up to a place where, and when I say my world, my inner world opened up so much, I start to really understand the depths of what your childhood can do to you, whether it is like on a positive or a negative side. I was like, whoa. So that really just accelerated my growth as a man. And then at that time, by the time I was getting my master's, I was 28, 29 years old, right? So that really accelerated my growth as a man, as a husband, as a father. And I really feel as if I didn't take that path, I probably wouldn't have been with my wife today, because I'm seeing other men who have not taken that step to get help. They're just like really lost and frustrated, and you just have a veiled view of how you look at life, right? So that is how I transitioned from, doing a religious education to becoming a therapist. And then when it came to the sports aspect, it's just, I love sports so much. And I have friends who are athletes. I have friends who played and who play. And I'm seeing that there is a major disconnect between how they play the sport and who they actually are. Right? And it has caused a lot of relationship issues in their life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think a couple of things stand out to me is one, that you were kind of stuck and weren't, feeling like you were living your purpose going into this religious studies degree. And I kind of see a lot of the athletes that we hear from and that follow us and will probably be tuning into this as well, might see a similarity of like, I'm leaving sports, but like this next thing is not for me. I don't find purpose in it. What do you do? And you asked people, where do you see me excelling? What do you think I'm good at? What are my strengths? And I think sometimes, obviously all the time we're our harshest critics, but I think sometimes we are blind to some of our own skills because they come so naturally to us. We don't understand that they necessarily are incredible skills because for us, they're just a part of who we are. So having other people reflect you back to you is so powerful. So I appreciate that piece of advice. And then what you said about athletes really being two different people, an on the field person and an off the field person, or a sport, if their sport is one person and then it's not connecting and jiving with who they are. I think that's really powerful too. And we've talked in workshops before to athletes that say, like, I didn't realize how much sport was a coping mechanism for me until I left sport, right? And so I think there's this huge gap of like, we think sport is this big, like it's fun and it's great and it's awesome and we get to play and that's our job, is to play, but there's so much wrapped up in sport for so many people. So I'd love to hear, how do you work with athletes? What are you working with them on? And I think, tell me a little bit about your work today and what resources you offer for athletes in the mental health world.
Yeah, so I'm currently working with a practice, No Limit Health and Education, on the sports division. We're building out the mental health sports division out, right, in the practice. So currently in the city of Orlando / Sanford, we have some schools that we're connected with, but we have a specific football team, high school football team that we're working with. And what I do is I go to a practice once a week, build rapport, see what's going on, talk to the guys, see what their plans are, see what they're trying to do, see what their heads are. And I also talk to the coaches, have a rapport with them because they give me some background of what's going on, right? So what I do is I go there and, if they have any issues, they come to me, they talk to me. And even the coaches, I really have to help them out because a lot of times, coaches, they're on the, I got to say it, like, they're on the performance track. Like, oh, I need them to perform, which is good. It's okay because that's their job, right? But I bring the aspect of like, hey, I need you to look at it from this perspective right here. Like I have one boy, he's 10th grade, wide receiver. He was doing great over the summer. He got a few D1 offers, but then last semester around like October, November, he started dipping and his dad was complaining and the coach was like, yo, man, I need you to talk to him. Like, he's not showing up to practice anymore. He's just not here. Like, mentally, emotionally, he's not here. I said, okay. I said, and explained to the coach, I said, hey, look, listen, this is not a magic wand here. I'm not just going to change him by having a conversation with him. That's just not how it works, right? But I'm going to speak to him and I'm going to see what's going on. So as I'm talking to him, or I'm not even talking, he's talking to me. He's letting me know what's going on. And the more and more he speaks, and that's what I realized, a lot of times we have the answers ourselves. We just have to talk it out. Right? So as a therapist, I'm just sitting back waiting for you to give me the answer so I can reveal to you that, hey, you have the answer. You just said it. So long story short, in the summertime, he was killing it. He was doing great. But now school starts, then they have late games, getting home at like 12, 1 in the morning. You have to wake up for school at 5:30 to get the bus at 6:30. He's just tired. He's drained. It's a major adjustment. He's in the 10th grade now. They're in block schedule. And I'm like, oh, okay. So what you're saying is you're just going through a major adjustment right now. I said, man, you're going to be okay. You just have to be able to know that this is a period of time where it's going to be challenging. But I said, don't take this time for granted because when you get to the next level, it's going to be even more like this. So use this as an opportunity to really sharpen that skill of being adaptable and going through challenging times. And he looked at me, he was like, oh, it's like his eyes lit up. He's like, it was kind of like he was saying, wow, you understand me. Because the parents want him to perform well in school. Of course. The coaches want him to perform well on the field. But now he has somebody that really understands what he's going on internally. And I promise you, even though I told the coach it's not a magic wand, but that's kind of what happened. He went back on the field and practiced. He was just clicking. He was clicking. And the coach comes in and says, what did you tell him? And I was like, coach, he just needed somebody to understand what he was going through, not necessarily someone to tell him what he needs to be doing. So, I play that voice there. And then I also do workshops for the seniors, preparing them for what they're going to see when they get to the next level in college, because I know they just like, oh, yeah, I have an offer at Florida State. I have an offer at Bethune-Cookman. And they're just excited. And I'm like, I'm happy for you guys, but I don't want you to get caught like a deer in the headlights. Here are the mental and emotional hurdles that you're going to face when you get there. And also doing workshops for the coaches as well to let them know that, hey, this is a whole person. Like, you have to treat the whole person. Or I let them know I'm here to help you guys treat the entire person, not just to get catches and tackles and points, but to also understand that there are other elements in their lives that will most definitely affect their performance. So we have to treat those other areas as well. So that's what I do when going to different teams and working with different programs.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that story too, because I think the understanding of, look, there are going to be challenging times, but we need to meet people where they are, and we can't just force production out of people, especially if they're not doing well emotionally or mentally. We need to work with them and figure out what's going on. So I really appreciate that story. And I know you have a podcast as well, and your focus from that podcast is really around bridging that gap between athletes and mental health. And I'd love to hear and tell me a little bit about the genesis behind the podcast. But I'd love to hear, as you share advice in this podcast, what advice do you have for athletes thinking about another big transition of like, what do I do when I'm retiring? What do I do when I'm graduating? And sport isn't in my next chapter, or it might not be, or, it has been, but it can't be in the future. What advice do you have for these big transition moments for athletes thinking about what's next to really kind of set themselves up for success? I don't think there's a catch-all solution, but what advice do you have? And in your experience and with the athletes you've worked with, has anything been really successful in terms of preparing for those big transitions?
Yeah, so the podcast is the giant fundamentals. And like you mentioned, I'm bridging the gap between mental health and sports, right? And and it's funny that you asked that question, because I feel like the second to last episode that I came out with, it spoke about that very thing that you're talking about right now. And off the top of my head, I know one of the things that really help is documenting, like really taking a step back, right? And reflecting on your experience as an athlete. Because, in this climate that we live in, living on the western side of the world, looking at, how we move, we don't like to stop or slow down. We just keep going. But the thing is, when you just go from one thing to the next without reflecting, without pausing, you don't realize that you're missing key elements from what you just came out of that will help you into the next season of your life. So for the athlete, and for anyone transitioning, it's really, you just have to take a step back and really look at every single thing as much as possible. Look at everything that you've gone through, all the ups and downs, and extract the lessons from those things, because I guarantee you those lessons are absolutely 100% transferable into your next season of life. And I feel like that is like one of the most important things to do. Because like I said, a lot of us, we don't take time to take a step back to really see, to extract the lessons. And most of the times when we don't take the time to step back and take the lessons, we actually bump our heads a whole lot longer and harder because we didn't take that time to do that process.
Yeah, so true. And I feel like it's again, I say this all the time, but it's not just athletes that go through transitions. We all do. And
Exactly.
it's a new year, and we're all setting resolutions and thinking about things. And I think a lot of people don't take the time to be like, all right, what am I going to accomplish, in this year versus last year? And I found myself rushing through and being like, this is what I'm going to do. And years go by and I still haven't done the resolutions that I wanted to. Why? Because I haven't reflected on why I didn't do it last year, right? I'm just like, well, gonna have to keep trying. But that reflection process is so important. And I love that you said, really focusing on what you've learned, but also just taking the time to reflect on your sports experience. What has it meant to you?
Yes.
What are you going to miss the most about it? What are you not going to miss about it, right? Get the good and the bad out there, and have these conversations, not just with yourself, but with other people. I think is so powerful, because it is sometimes that just kind of grieving process or reflecting process, however you want to look at it, that can make such a big difference to kind of take the time to really reflect and say, this chapter of my life is closing and it's going to look different from here, but like, let me reflect and bask in all of the amazingness I've experienced. And I appreciate you sharing that. That's such good advice.
You mentioned one of the points in that episode too was about grieving, right? There are a lot of similarities to transitioning from something that you probably did for 25 plus years, 20 years, 15 years, however long it was. There's a lot of similarities from grieving a death of someone or a pet and the next leaving your career behind, as far as like being that athlete. There's a lot of similarities when you're talking about the grieving process. And there's something that my business and partner and we always say is one of our principles for our company is fast is slow and slow is fast. Because we want to just rush into the next thing and we don't want to deal with whatever just happened, not realizing that you're actually going to make a whole lot more mistakes by going so fast. But if you slow down and take your time to really extract the lessons and the principles for what you've experienced, what you learned, then you actually progress quicker.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about before, where it's if you take the time to reflect and you take that time to learn from what you're experiencing, you know, it makes a difference even in that way. You know, take the time. Don't feel like you have to be the first to do something or, you know, get there the fastest, especially like you said, if there's a bunch of mistakes along the way.
Yep.
I think that's really, really such good advice. And before we go, I don't know if Belford's still on, but he had a great question in the chat. It's a long one, but I'm going to try and summarize it. And, you know, he really asked around metrics of success when it comes to mental health, right? Obviously, coaches, spectators, fans, they're looking at performance. They're judged by performance, right? These athletes. So what are some preventative measures that can be done to support athletes before they hit that wall, right? Are there things that administrators, that, you know, support staff, that coaches can start to think about and implement on their teams? And I know this is a big question. So, you know, just whatever it can come up with in the moment, but whatever you've experienced too, you know, are there any preventative measures that teams, administration should really start to think about with their athletes to kind of start to work on this before issues pop up with individuals, right? Anything you have to add to that question?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we're looking for these fancy answers. It's pretty simple. And the first thing that popped to my mind when you asked that question is the ability to exercise empathy. Just being understanding and being a listening ear. It sounds so simple, but it does a great deal. Because if you're thinking about someone who is asked to perform at a very high level, every single time that they step on the field, the court, whatever it is, psychologically, eventually they're going to start to feel as if they're a machine, they're a robot. That's just what it is. And if you feel that way, you're going to think that people don't really care about what you're really going through. They just want to see you do X. But if we're talking about administrators, coaches, so on and so forth, if it's just one that is just that listening ear, and you're talking about things that are not even related to the game and the sport and the performance itself, then there's a level of connectivity that athlete will have with whatever administrator or coach or wherever it is. And I really want to do a study on this, but I feel like performance just gets better because I've seen it when I do it one-on-one. I've seen a shift, right? It's as if the athlete becomes unburdened. It's the weirdest thing. It's like they just, you know, all the weight of the world just lifts off their shoulders, right? So I really feel as if there's someone there, that's what coaches, athletes, that's what they can do. Just be more empathetic, be more understanding. And I know it's kind of challenging to tote that line because you got to perform, but in the same breath, you also have to put yourself in the seat of really listening and understanding what that athlete is going through.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really, really great piece of advice. And again, I love what you said right at the beginning of your answer. You know, sometimes it seems like we have big answers. We need big questions need big answers. Excuse me. But, you know, really sometimes the big questions need simple answers, and empathy is a really simple first step. And of course, there's multiple other things I'm sure that could be a long list of preventative measures, but empathy seems like a really great place to start. And listening, like you did with the example you gave with the student you were working with, where you just met him where he was and had a conversation and said, hey, how's it going? What is going on?
Right.
You know, what do you want to talk about? So, you know, Jonathan, we're wrapping up on time, and I really appreciate you being here. I just want to close out by really giving you a chance to plug your practice, give you a chance to plug the podcast. Where can people connect with you if they want to learn more about the work you're doing? If folks have more questions that they want to ask around implementing mental health preventative measures on their teams. And then also, you know, where can they listen to the podcast? Where can they connect with you personally? Just give us kind of a rundown of where to find you, and if anything's coming up, feel free to plug that too.
Absolutely. So the podcast is Giant Fundamentals. You can find it on Apple, You can find it on Spotify as well. I'm not really big on social media like that, like I used to be. However, I'm going to do a better job. So give me a Jono the Giant. You can reach me on Instagram. I'll be there, on Twitter as well. But really, if you really want to connect with me, send me an email at jonothegiant1, the number one, at gmail.com. And a great resource, honestly, is my podcast, because a lot of the stuff I am plugging into that podcast. So I love the questions. I love the dialogue. I love the conversation, because what it does for me, it helps me to go do some more research to find out, okay, let me try to answer these questions on the podcast. Because I realize if it's one person that's asking it, then a whole lot of other people have the same type of question. So, yes, I have to say, Danielle, thank you so much for having me. You are the greatest.
Oh, right back at you. I'm so excited. I am a listener of the podcast, and for all of you that are going to go tune in, Jonathan and I did a podcast for his as well, so you'll hear a familiar voice. But yeah, Jonathan, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing. The work you're doing is so important, and I'm excited to continue to collaborate and really focus on athlete mental health here moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Danielle. I appreciate it.
Right. Thanks. Thanks to everybody for tuning in as well. And we'll see you guys next time on Timeout. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Yes, ma'am.
Bye.
Bye.